Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. My name is Summer Sanchez and this channel is all about crime, cults, and heinous history. And just a real quick mention here, if my voice is sounding a little off, I actually just found out this morning that I have COVID. Thankfully, I feel pretty much normal at this point. I have just a slight cough and that's really it. And I'm really hoping that it stays that way. I was actually just getting ready to book my booster shot, but I guess that's gonna have to wait. Now, as far as this case goes, I would not be surprised at all if you have never heard of it. I had never heard of it until I just happened to stumble upon this documentary. And once I saw the documentary, I immediately started digging into the court documents and stuff, and it's crazy. This cult goes by a couple of names. It's been called the Cause. It's been called the Order of the Lion. I've also heard this cult referred to as the Camp Cult. It was led by a man named Gerald Cruz in the mid 80s all the way through to 1990, which was the year that this crime takes place. There is a very small chance that you might have heard of this case if you followed the Laci Peterson story when it was unfolding. The Laci Peterson case happened in the same area of California as this case. And some of the people involved in Scott Peterson's defense, and even just some people that closely followed Laci Peterson's story, thought that a satanic cult might actually be involved with her disappearance. And this cult does have some satanic elements to it, so some people thought that maybe there was a connection there. And this potential connection was actually looked into, but there really isn't any evidence to suggest that this was the case. But this cult in particular did actually get brought up when this satanic cult theory was being looked into. There really wasn't a defined religious doctrine that this cult followed. They mainly just worshipped their leader, Gerald Cruz, and they just pretty much did whatever he wanted to do. And his beliefs were changing constantly, and the group would just follow him with whatever he was doing at that point. And because of this, the group has actually been referred to by psychologists as a cult of personality, and you'll definitely see why later in the case. Gerald was a sadistic master manipulator, and he basically just preyed upon weak, vulnerable people who had no one else to turn to. And once his members became completely dependent on him psychologically, physically, all of it, he would turn on them and he would do these really weird, twisted things. And unfortunately, Gerald had such a hold over the members that he convinced them to commit an absolute massacre. And in the end, 4 people were killed. Now, just a heads up, before we get into the case, there are hardly any photos, okay? I had to search and search and search to find the very few photos that I actually found on this case. But as always, I'm going to do my best to add as much as I possibly can. But I did just want to kind of warn you that some of the key players in this case, I just couldn't find a photo for. And with all of that being said, let's get into the case. So on May 21st, 1990, police get a call at around 2 a.m. that there have been multiple murders at a home on the corner of Mason and Elm Street in Salida, California. When police arrived, they found the bodies of 4 victims. There were 3 male victims and 1 female. The victims were quickly identified as 35-year-old Dennis Colwell, 25-year-old Richard Ritchie, 51-year-old Franklin Raper, who police would later discover is actually the homeowner, and a woman named Darlene Paris, who was 23 at the time. Police also find out that there is 1 survivor, a woman named Donna Alvarez. When the attack began, Donna managed to escape and she ran into the garage of the home and she hid under a pile of dirty clothes, and she basically stayed there until she thought the attack was over. Then she pried open the garage door and she slipped out and she bolted to a neighbor's house. And of course the neighbor opens the door, lets Donna in. She's completely hysterical, but she kind of gives them a rundown of what has just happened, and the neighbor immediately calls the police. And Donna is in complete shock. When the police arrived, she was still on scene and she was found with a blanket over her head because she just didn't want to see anymore. She was afraid that she was going to see something else. Of course, the police asked Donna to tell them everything that she possibly can about what's happened. Donna tells them that she had been staying at the home of Franklin Raper, which is the home where all of this took place. Franklin had offered to let her stay there because she really didn't have anywhere else to go. I believe she was homeless at the time. And Franklin would do this. He would let people come and stay at his house if they needed to. She had actually been introduced to Franklin Raper by one of the other victims, Richard Ritchie. Donna also tells them that there were multiple people involved in the attack. She told them that all these people wearing camo had just burst into the house. They were coming through doors, they were coming through the windows. They just started attacking everyone inside. She said that one of the men that came in was holding a silver gun, and he was one of the only people there that was not wearing a mask. And when police ask her to describe him, she says that he is a white male that's about 6 feet tall, and he appeared to be in his mid-20s. And then she said he had afro-like hair. And the description of the suspect's hair is kind of what stood out to the police. So while they were still there on the scene, they saw a local man just kind of hovering in the area. One of the detectives approaches this person, and he asks this person if they know of anyone who fits this description of a white male with afro-like hair. And surprisingly, this guy is like, yeah, I know who you're talking about. His name is Jason. He lives over at the camp. We end up finding out that the camp was actually an old labor camp, but now it just had like some campers and trailers parked on it, and there were people living there. So the detectives go speak to some of the neighbors that live near the camp, and they find out that the people living at the camp were involved in some weird military group, and they had apparently been intimidating some of the locals. So the neighbors that lived near the camp basically knew to just stay away from these people. The neighbors also gave them some names of some of the people living at the camp at that time. They tell them that Gerald Cruz, David Beck, Ricky Vieira, and Jason LaMarche were 4 men that lived permanently at the camp. So the police are like super interested in this Jason guy. The neighbors also tell them that one of the victims, Franklin Raper, had actually lived at the camp at one point, but he had recently left the camp and moved to that house on Elm Street because he had a big falling out with some of the other men. So all of this information definitely piqued the detectives' interest. Now there is a connection between this weird group living at the camp and one of the victims. And now the police are starting to feel like they're going to find the answer to all of their questions at the camp. But before they head out to the camp, they decide to run Jason LaMarche's name through their system just to see if they have a prior record on him, and they do. So that means that they actually already have a photo of Jason LaMarche. So they get this photo and they go to Donna Alvarez and they show her like a lineup, and she immediately picks Jason LaMarche out of the lineup. So he is prime suspect number 1. So the police head over to the camp to ask some questions, see if Jason LaMarche is there. But when they get there, no one is at the camp. But while they're there, they do start to notice a few little things. First of all, they notice that there's actually a house on the property. It's this little studio that's kind of towards the back of the property. And then they see some camouflage clothing hanging on a clothesline outside, like it had just been freshly washed. And the clothing matches the description that Donna Alvarez had given the police. The house that the police saw on the property, they would later find out belonged to Gerald Cruz and his wife Jennifer. And the police decided they're just going to pack up and leave and maybe try to come back again later since no one's there. But right as they go to leave, Gerald Cruz drives up. He gets out of his car and police just kind of start asking him some questions just to kind of get a feel of how he acts. But Gerald is completely calm. He tells police that he doesn't know anything about these murders. He has nothing to do with them. He doesn't know anything about them. And before detectives decide to leave, they ask Gerald to give them the names of the other people living at the camp at that time. He tells them that David Beck, Jason LaMarche, and Ricky Vieira also were residents at the camp. Police basically leave the camp and head straight out to get a search warrant. Based on the positive ID of Jason LaMarche and also the camouflage clothing that the police found at the camp, they had grounds to get a search warrant. So they get the warrant and they head back over to the camp to execute it. So once the police execute the search warrant, they found a plethora of strange and disturbing stuff. So first off, they start in Gerald and Jennifer's house and they find bomb making materials. So we're not off to a good start. They also found all sorts of like military manuals. They also found a book called The Big Book of Secret Hiding Places, which is a book that gives tips on like where you can hide contraband. And they also found some satanic literature such as the Satanic Bible. And then they found something really strange. They found this like wooden wheel, and on this will, there were like different forms of punishment. So they don't know what that's all about. Then they discover some journals, and the journals contain some very disturbing facts about the group that's living at the camp. And these journals really helped the investigators fill in some of these gaps that they had. And now it's really looking like these people were involved in something really weird, really disturbing. And based on what they were reading in these journals, it sounds as if Gerald Cruz is leading a cult at the camp. Gerald Dean Cruz was originally born Gerald Dean Cox in Modesto, California, sometime in March of 1962. All throughout his life, there were questions about who his actual parents were. Gerald believed that his mother was a woman named Hortensia Cruz, and that's kind of the person who raised him. His father was a man named Asensio Cruz. Now, Asensio had moved back to Mexico before Gerald was even born. He didn't even know that Hortensia was pregnant. And since Asensio left and went back to Mexico, Hortensia decided that she was going to put another man's name on the birth certificate, and this man was a friend named Lawrence Cox. At least this is the story that Hortensia told Gerald. Asensio did eventually return back to Modesto when Gerald was about 2 years old. When he arrived, he was shocked. He didn't know that he even had a kid on the way. And Gerald had been told that his last name was Cruz pretty much his whole life, but when he started school, he was being called this weird name. They were calling him by the last name of Cox. And this is actually how Gerald found out about his birth certificate having another man's name on it. And he was really confused. And honestly, after reading all of the court reports on this case, it's hard to know the truth of who Gerald's parents really were. There were so many members of Gerald's family that testified at his trial, and they all told different versions of Gerald's childhood, including who his parents were. It's reported that Gerald suffered at least 2 pretty bad head injuries when he was a kid. Once when he was just an infant, his stepsister Hope accidentally dropped him on some concrete and he fell on his head and he was injured pretty badly, but the family just assumed that he would be fine and they didn't take him to the hospital. They said he was pretty much back to normal pretty soon after this head injury. The only real thing they noticed was that he didn't want to take a bottle for a few days, which seems a little alarming to me. They definitely should have taken him to the hospital. Another time was when Gerald was about 4. He went through the windshield of a car when whoever was driving slammed on the brakes really hard. And again, they assumed that he would recover and they didn't take him to the hospital. Now, like I said, Gerald grew up with a ton of doubt surrounding who his parents actually were. And one day, one of his mother's ex-husbands told Gerald that Asensio was not his father. And of course, this just made things worse for Gerald. Now he was even more confused. But he said as long as he knew that Hortensia was his real mother, then he was okay. But according to a woman named Marlene, who is one of Gerald's half-sisters, this was all a lie. She later testified that Hope, the sister I mentioned earlier, the one that dropped Gerald on his head when he was an infant, Marlene said that she was actually his mother, like Hope was. And she said that Gerald's real father was a man named Lawrence Cox, which is the man that was on his original birth certificate. Marlene was about 14 years old when Gerald was born, and she remembers him being severely abused as a child. She said that Hortensia was a violent woman and she would even harm animals at times. And I do want to give a warning here. I am going to very briefly talk about animal abuse. I will put a timestamp on the screen so you can just jump past it if you don't want to hear that. And believe me, I don't blame you. So according to Marlene, at one point Hortensia had a pet canary and she thought that a cat got a hold of it and ate it. So she got this cat and she cut it open to see if her bird was in there. There was also another time that Marlene told about where Hortensia got really angry about a neighbor's dog that kept wandering onto her yard. So she caught the dog, and let's just say that she made sure that the dog could never walk onto her property again. And you will have to use your imagination because honestly, I can't bring myself to tell you what she did to the dog. It's horrible. And according to Hope, who is either Gerald's half-sister or his mother, we don't know, Hortensia had several older children by the time Gerald was born. Some of them were in their 20s before Gerald was even born. And Hope said that Hortensia did not tell Asensio that she had any children before Gerald. She allegedly told him that all of the kids were actually her nieces and nephews. Except for one of Gerald's older brothers, he was 24 by the time Gerald was born, and Hortensia told Asensio that he was just a friend, and she would make her children call her by her first name just to keep up with the lie. She even made backstories for some of them, like Marlene. Her backstory was that she was one of Hortensia's nieces and her parents had died, and that's why she was always around Hortensia. And I just can't imagine this situation. Like, it sounds insane. Now, Gerald was the only one of the children that was allowed to call Hortensia mom, and that was because Asensio, her husband, thought that Gerald was his child. According to Marlene, Hope and Hortensia would fight a lot about who was going to take care of Gerald. And they would often beat Gerald with switches and ropes, cords, umbrellas, and hangers. And unfortunately, it sounds like he had a rough time at school as well. He was teased and bullied relentlessly. The kids would target Gerald because of his hair and his clothes, and they would also tease him a lot because he didn't know who his father was. And the bullying just continued throughout Gerald's school life. He was actually hit in the head with a rubber mallet while he was in high school, and he ended up dropping out by the time he was a sophomore. Eventually, he just couldn't take it anymore, and so he just decided to leave. Some of the experts that have interviewed Gerald after this case happens have said that Gerald not knowing who his parents were really had a very disturbing effect on his life. And it kind of started his search for some sort of identity. And because he couldn't pinpoint his true identity, he created one himself. And Gerald convinced himself that he was special in some way, that he had special powers, special abilities. He eventually started to buy into what he had created. These delusions, coupled with his terrible childhood, I think really shaped Gerald into what he was going to become as an adult. As he got older, all of these issues kind of morphed. It just came out in this really sadistic way, and it definitely shows in the way he runs his cult. Gerald's beliefs were really hard to pinpoint. Like I said earlier, there isn't a lot known, but we do know that he was into white supremacy, and he would talk a lot about the idea of there being a master race. And the cult that Gerald would later go on to create has been described as a perfect example of a cult of personality. His beliefs were not etched in stone. They weren't super defined. So the cult just really revolved around Gerald himself.
There are different kinds of cults. There are cults that have a very defined system of belief. But when it is that the beliefs are so ever-changing and eclectic, then the thing that really matters is the leader.
As Gerald got older, he started to surround himself with more vulnerable people who were homeless or had lost touch with their families and had no one else to turn to. Those are the kind of people that he wanted to prey on because he knew that they would depend on him eventually. Gerald would offer them a safe place to stay. He would lure them in with all kind of promises of being a family and all this stuff, and things would actually be pretty good for a little bit for these people. But then eventually, once Gerald knew that he could take advantage of the situation, he would. That's when things would just turn really dark. And I found this quote from a psychologist that was familiar with this case, and they said that because Cruz had a hard time succeeding in society, he had, quote, withdrawn and collected around himself a band of people almost like a Neanderthal clan, which perfectly describes this cult. As Gerald got older, he became extremely interested in black magic and the occult and witchcraft, Satanism, that kind of stuff, which in itself does not equate to murder or being a cult leader, anything like that. In Gerald's case, I really think that his upbringing derailed his life. So by the time Gerald is in his early 20s, he is living in a home in Modesto, and that's when he meets Ricky Vieira. And I'm not really sure how old Ricky was when he met Gerald, but my guess would be about 15 or 16 years old. Ricky came from a terrible home life, just like Gerald did. He was badly abused by his father, and his mother pretty much just ignored him and neglected him his whole life. And by the time he was a teenager, he was desperately looking for a way out of his situation. And that's when he's introduced to Gerald Cruz. And Ricky fits that mold for Gerald perfectly. Gerald of course, swoops in and offers to make Ricky's life so much better. He offers him a place to stay. He tells him that he'll be a part of his family, that he'll lead him down the right path. Ricky jumps at this opportunity and he does move into Gerald's home, and things were actually okay for a little while. Ricky really started to feel like he actually did belong there, that he was a part of the family. Gerald had two childhood friends who ended up becoming members of the cult in the mid-80s. A man named David Beck and another man named Stephen Perkins. David Beck, like I said, had known Gerald since childhood, but they had kind of drifted apart at one point in their lives. David Beck got married. He was really successful in his career. He was extremely devout in his faith. He was Pentecostal and he was like really into his church and his religion, but he and his wife ended up getting divorced. This is when things kind of started to go downhill for him and he just kind of lost his way. And this is when he meets back up with Gerald Cruz. They kind of reconnect at this point. And David Beck would actually go on to become Gerald's second in command in the cult. David Beck's family would later say that his demeanor completely changed after he reconnected with Gerald Cruz. He had once been very happy, very bubbly. He was like really involved with his children's lives and stuff. But once he got back with Gerald, he became a completely different person. He was totally withdrawn, almost like a zombie. It was almost like you were talking to a wall whenever you would try to talk to him. There was just like nothing there. Gerald Cruz and David Beck had another old friend named Ron Willie, and he also reconnects with Gerald and with Beck, and he gets wrapped up in this whole thing as well. So Stephen Perkins moved in with Gerald around the same time that Ricky Vieira did. At this point, Gerald's really laying the foundation of the cult, and he gives all of the men journals. Remember those journals that police found during the search warrant? That's these journals. And Gerald would make the men write in them constantly. He would tell them to write all about their insecurities, their fears, just their thoughts, their spiritual journey, almost like therapy. He would read all the stuff that they would write in these journals, and then he would just prey on their fears and their insecurities. Gerald actually kept a journal himself, and in his journal, he would make the men cut their hands and then put a bloody fingerprint inside as basically like a binding contract that you are dedicated and devoted to Gerald. Gerald also started making the men take part in these weekly ceremonies where they would light candles and stuff, and then they would dress all in like these white robes that very closely resembled KKK robes. And during these ceremonies, they would just like chant and speak gibberish. In one of the articles that I was reading about this case, one of the experts said that this cult was literally all over the place. One minute they're talking about God, the next minute it's military, then the next minute it's the occult and black magic. Like Gerald didn't know what the hell he was doing. And not long after Ricky Vieira and Stephen Perkins moved in with Gerald, the abuse started. Gerald would beat the two men constantly. One thing that Gerald loved to do was make the men stand completely still in the middle of a room, and then he would punch them as hard as he possibly could in the stomach. And on at least one occasion, he punched Stephen Perkins so hard that he ended up in the hospital. He would also use a scorpion stun gun on the men as well, like just for fun. Like I said earlier, Beck ended up becoming Gerald's like right-hand man, and no one ever saw Gerald abuse Beck. He was kind of like the exception. And Beck would actually take part in the abuse of the men as well. Gerald and Beck would perform something that they called the orange line treatment. The orange line referred to an orange extension cord, and Gerald would cut an extension cord and then he would attach the severed end to one of the men's feet, and he would wrap it with duct tape. Then he would plug it into an outlet. Now this outlet that he would plug it into was actually tied into a light switch on the wall. So if you flipped on the switch, it would send electricity to the outlet and then electrocute the men. And this is what he did. He would go and flip the switch on the wall, and he would just watch as the men were electrocuted, and he and Beck would just laugh. And on one occasion, after the orange line treatment was inflicted on Stephen Perkins, his foot was injured so badly that it turned black and it became extremely infected. By 1987, Gerald started dating a 16-year-old girl named Jennifer Starn, and he is 25 at this point. So now it is Jennifer, Gerald Cruz, Stephen Perkins, and Ricky Vieira that are all all living in Gerald's home in Modesto. And at this point, Gerald already has like a very strong psychological hold over Vieira and Perkins, and he was beating them on a regular basis. And he didn't even try to hide this from Jennifer when she first started coming around. He would do this openly in front of her. And of course, eventually Gerald started abusing Jennifer as well. When she would make him mad, he would put a gun in her mouth and he would say, quote, "Are you going to get your shit together or are you going to die?" He would severely physically abuse Jennifer quite frequently as well. Very quickly after they got together, Jennifer became pregnant and then she became pregnant again. So they had 2 infants pretty quickly after they started dating. She felt like she couldn't get out of the situation. And also Gerald was constantly threatening to kill her if she ever tried to leave. When Jennifer was about 2 months pregnant with one of her children, Cruz pushed her to the ground and he just started repeatedly kicking her in her stomach and in between her legs. And of course, this caused her to start bleeding, and Jennifer was in a panic. She actually ran out of the house barefoot without any of her belongings, and she went straight to a women's shelter. She ended up staying there for about 4 days, but eventually Gerald found out where she was and he convinced her to come back. And I don't know if Jennifer lost that baby or not. I do know that they go on to have 3 children together total. So I'm not sure if this one made it or not, but I know that it was extremely traumatic for Jennifer. The next stuff that I'm about to tell you is gonna make you so mad. It was really hard to read. Not only was Gerald abusive to the men in his group and to his girlfriend Jennifer, but he was also abusive to his infant children. According to the court documents that I read, they referred to one of the kids in particular quite a bit, and they just refer to her as A. I'm assuming just to protect her identity, so I'm just going to refer to her as baby A. So when baby A was only 6 months old, as a form of punishment, Gerald put her in a dark room all by herself, and he would only allow Jennifer to go in every 6 hours. He wouldn't allow Jennifer to go in and hold her or console her or anything like that. It was basically like solitary confinement. And of course, Jennifer was not okay with this at all. And when she tried to vocalize this, Gerald would just beat her up. This 6-month-old baby was forced to sit in a dark room for hours by herself. And anytime baby A made Gerald angry, he would also hit her on her legs with a fly swatter or a ruler. Jennifer also said that Gerald had something built that he called the rack. He would suspend baby A in like a harness from this rack, and then he would attach mason jars full of water to baby A's legs. And then he would intentionally make baby A cry so that her legs would instinctively like move up and down like baby's legs do. Basically, so her legs would be weighed down by the mason jars and she wouldn't really be able to move her legs. He would also slap baby A really hard on the side of her head with his open hand. And he referred to this as a clapping. And he would hit her so hard sometimes that she would have bruising on the inside of her ears. And when baby A was learning how to walk, Gerald would wait for her to be standing up, like about to take a step, and then he'd ask her if she wanted a clapping. And baby A would get so scared she would immediately drop to the ground and she would hide her head in her hands. And Gerald thought this was hilarious. Who the hell does this stuff? I already know what happens in this case, like I'm familiar with what he did to his daughter, but just saying it out loud makes me so pissed. And sometimes other men in Gerald's little group would take part in the abuse of baby A. On one occasion, Gerald, Beck, and Vieira put a tape recorder next to baby A in her crib while she was laying down, and they waited for her to start to drift off to sleep, and then they snuck up on her and then they screamed as loud as they could to scare her, and she woke up and she was just hysterical. She was screaming and crying. And since the men decided that they were going to record this whole thing, there was evidence that they actually did this. And Jennifer brought the tape with her when she testified at the trial. And she played the tape for the court. So there's no question that this happened. In late 1989, Gerald, Jennifer, and their 2 infants moved to the camp. They moved into this really small house at the camp, and Vieira came with him, and he was staying in a trailer next to Gerald and Jennifer's house. But Stephen Perkins did not move to the camp with them. He actually ended up moving back home when Gerald moved out of the Modesto house, and he moved back in with his parents. But it does still seem like he was affiliated with the group to some capacity, and Stephen Perkins' parents would later say that when he returned home to them, he was a completely different person. So Stephen lived with Gerald for 17 months in that Modesto home. And Stephen's father said within that 17 months, Stephen had lost 125 pounds. And he had gone from this happy-go-lucky guy to this like really moody, withdrawn person. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He wouldn't answer the phone. He didn't want to go outside. He basically just stopped associating with anyone. And he didn't want to tell his parents anything about what happened at Gerald Cruz's home. He also became extremely claustrophobic, which was something new. And when he came home, he was in really bad shape. He had broken bones from all the beatings that Gerald had given him, and his foot was extremely infected from the orange line treatments. But Stephen was told not to tell how he got these injuries. Gerald warned him that if he said anything, that he would hurt him or hurt his family. And he told Stephen to just tell everybody that he had been in a motorcycle accident. And that's what he told them. Stephen even started having mental lapses where he would forget what day of the week it was or even what month it was. And eventually he did become suicidal, and he tried to take his own life several times. He ended up getting so bad off that he admitted himself into a psychiatric hospital. So when Gerald and Jennifer and their kids moved to the camp in 1989, Beck and Vieira moved with them, and they ended up living in this trailer right by their house. And just because they moved houses does not mean that the abuse stopped. It still kept going. And now that Stephen Perkins was not living with them, Ricky Vieira took on the bulk of the abuse. So Gerald liked to use something called the will of punishment when he would get mad at his cult members. And we've talked about this briefly earlier when the police found this wheel, this weird wheel at the house during the search warrant. But what it was it was a wooden wheel, and it was divided into sections, kind of like how you would cut a pie, and each different section had a different form of punishment on it. And Gerald would make the men throw the wheel into the air and then catch it, and wherever their thumb landed, that was the punishment that they had. Some of the punishments included eating off the floor like an animal for mealtime. There was solitary confinement as one of the punishments, and of course, severe beatings. And eventually the abuse did escalate to sexual assault. So as another form of punishment, Gerald would force the men to sodomize each other in front of the rest of the cult. And Ricky Vieira was the one that had to do this the most. Not long after they moved to the camp, a couple of other important people do show up onto the property as well. Jason LaMarche and Franklin Raper. Jason started living at the camp in early 1990, and he actually only knew Gerald and the other men for like a couple of months before the murders took place. Jason very quickly got mixed up with Gerald Cruz and the rest of the members, but Franklin Raper was not invited to be a part of Gerald's little circle. No one liked Franklin Raper. He really didn't get along with anyone at the camp. And the problems really started when one night Franklin Raper and Jason LaMarche, they were sharing a trailer for whatever reason. They were staying in the same trailer. LaMarche had fallen asleep, and when he woke up, he found that his pants pocket, like where the pocket was, had been cut, and he had had a gun in there, and the gun was now missing. So he automatically assumes that Franklin stole his gun, which I never got confirmation if he did or not. I think Franklin did actually steal his gun, but I don't really know that for sure. And LaMarche didn't know for sure, but he was convinced that Franklin had done it. And this is really where all the trouble started, because from that day on, LaMarche hated Franklin Raper, like with a passion. And he would go and vent about him to Gerald all the time. Gerald claimed that he did not like Franklin Raper because he was a drug user, and he said that he would leave his needles around sometimes, and he was just worried about the kids. But we know how he treats his children, so I highly doubt that this is why Gerald didn't like Franklin. The men would fight quite a bit about pretty much everything, and it was always Franklin Raper against the other men. And eventually one day, Gerald just told Franklin that he needed to leave. He needed to move his trailer off of the camp property. Franklin refused. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him into leaving. So one day while Franklin was out, Gerald hooked Franklin's trailer up to one of their cars and they pulled it off of the property and parked it somewhere. Then they took Franklin's car and filled it with some of his belongings and pushed it across the street from the camp and then lit it on fire. And as you can imagine, this did not go over well when Franklin found out. Gerald said that after this happened, Franklin threatened him and threatened his family. Again, I don't know if this actually happened. This is just according to Gerald. But pretty soon after this, Franklin did end up moving. He ended up moving into that house on Elm Street right after this happened. Now, this house on Elm Street is affiliated with the cult in some way. The house actually belonged to the sister of Jason LaMarche's girlfriend. And Jason LaMarche's girlfriend was a woman named Michelle Evans, and she's very important in this case. Michelle's sister Tanya lived at the house on Elm Street, and it seems as though she was still living there when Franklin Raper moved in. So they must have known each other somehow. Now, even though Gerald got what he wanted and Franklin Raper was now no longer living at the camp, that wasn't enough. Gerald decided that Franklin Raper needed to die. Now, the morning before the murders, Michelle Evans needed to go to the Elm Street house. There were some things that she needed to get out of the home, some furniture that she needed to move. So she asked Gerald Cruz and Jason LaMarche, Ricky Vieira, all those people to come with her over to the house to help her move this stuff. And they knew that Franklin Raper was going to be there, but they went anyways. And it didn't take long before a fight broke out and Jason LaMarche and Franklin Raper got into a physical altercation. I think they left right after this fight happened. They had only been there for about 45 minutes and they all head back to the camp. This whole situation just angered Gerald even more, and it convinced him that Franklin Raper really did need to die. So after the men returned back to the camp, Gerald really put his plan into motion. Gerald also called his friend Ron Willie, which we haven't really talked about Ron very much, but I did mention him earlier. He had been friends with Gerald and some of the other men for years. He did not live at the camp with the other people, but he was affiliated with Gerald and his cult. Gerald gathered up everyone in Jason LaMarche's trailer. This included Michelle Evans. She was also present as well. Gerald told them that they were going to go to the house on Elm Street and they were going to kill Franklin Raper, and they were going to kill anyone that was there at the time. They were to leave no witnesses. And Gerald knew that Franklin had a habit of letting random people stay with him. So there was a very real possibility that Franklin was not going to be the only person there that night. And Gerald started kind of delegating different jobs to the members of the cult, and Michelle Evans' job was to draw a blueprint of the house. They wanted to know where all the windows were, the doors, everything like that. She was also instructed to go into the house before everyone else. She was to try to get anyone who was there kind of like towards the front of the house in the living room to make it easier for them to be attacked. On the night of May 20th, 1990, there was a big barbecue at the camp. Gerald and all of his group were there, and they were all doing drugs and reportedly listening to heavy metal music and swinging around bats and batons to just kind of pump themselves up for what they were getting ready to do. Then just after midnight on May 21st, 1990, Michelle Evans, Jason LaMarche, Gerald Cruz, Ricky Vieira, David Beck, and Ron Willie all got into a car and headed over to Franklin's house. They were all armed with knives, batons, and bats. All of them were wearing camouflage clothing and masks except for Michelle Evans and Jason LaMarche. Jason LaMarche also had a gun with him, but I don't think he planned to use this. I think it was more of a scare tactic. On that particular night, Franklin Raper was not alone in the house. There were actually 4 other people staying with him there that night. 35-year-old Dennis Colwell, 25-year-old Richard Ritchie, 23-year-old Darlene Paris, and 22-year-old Donna Alvarez were all in Franklin Raper's home that night. I'm not sure how all of the people knew each other. Unfortunately, there wasn't a ton of information about the victims in this case. Gerald and the group arrived in the car and they parked down the street from Franklin Raper's house. Michelle Evans and Jason LaMarche get out and they head to the house. Michelle went in first to make sure the windows and doors were unlocked. It It sounds like Michelle just went into the house with no problem. It probably wasn't weird for Franklin to see Michelle come in. Her sister lived there. I forgot to mention this, but Gerald actually told Michelle to call her sister Tanya and tell her not to go home that night. So Tanya was not in the house. Donna Alvarez, the only survivor of the attack, was sleeping in one of the bedrooms, and she was suddenly woken up by Michelle. Michelle tapped her on the shoulder and told her that she needed to get up because Tanya needed that bedroom. So Donna just grabs her stuff, she gets up, and she walks out of the room. After Donna walked out, Michelle unlocked the window so that the men could come in. Donna walks into the living room where Franklin Raper is sitting in a chair, and she asks him where she can sleep, and he tells her you can sleep anywhere. So she and Richard Ritchie start walking towards another one of the bedrooms where they were going to go to sleep. This is when Beck and Vieira enter the house through the window, and they just rush into the living room. And about that same time, the rest of the men all come in as well. They all just kind of swarmed all the people in the house, and it was pure chaos. Everyone was screaming and panicking. No one really understood what was happening. And as the attack started, Michelle Evans didn't want to be in the house. So she walked out the door and she headed back to the car, and she just waited there for the men to get done. And as she walked out of the house, she could hear a woman screaming and pleading for her life. And that woman was Darlene Paris. As the attacks were starting, Donna Alvarez manages to sneak away just because of all the chaos. No one really noticed her. And that's when she slipped into the garage. She covered herself with a pile of dirty clothes, and she just waited there until she thought the attack was over. Jason LaMarche came straight for Franklin Raper. Like I said, Franklin Raper was sitting in a chair in the living room when the attack started. Jason LaMarche pulled out either a bat or a baton, and he started to beat Franklin. Franklin Raper tried to protect himself by throwing his arms up, and Jason LaMarche hit him so hard that it broke his arm. And then he just relentlessly beat Franklin Raper. He beat him so badly that he was unrecognizable by the time the attack was done. And after he was done beating him, he pulled out a knife and slit his throat. Dennis Colwell and Richard Ritchie are being attacked by Gerald and the other men. While all this is going on, Darlene Paris is freaking out. She's watching all this happen, and she's just screaming and begging them not to hurt her. And Gerald finally gets annoyed with Darlene, and he looks at Ricky Vieira and he says, "You need to shut her up." And that's when Ricky Vieira grabbed Darlene by the hair and pulled her head back and began cutting at her throat. And he didn't stop until he felt bone. By the time he was done, Darlene was essentially decapitated. Now, one of the victims managed to escape the house, and he made it all the way to the front lawn before Gerald Cruz and Ron Willey caught up with him. And then they just began brutally beating him, and eventually they cut his throat as well. Now, this murder was committed outside, and there were actually witnesses that saw this happen, and they were in shock. They did not know what was going on. And once they saw Gerald Cruz cut Richard Ritchie's throat, the neighbors kind of panicked and they went back inside the house. In the end, all 4 victims had been completely brutalized with either a bat or a baton, and then all of their throats had been cut. After the autopsies, it was concluded that Dennis Colwell suffered a skull fracture, multiple stab wounds to his face, chest, hands, and abdomen, and his jugular vein, carotid artery, and larynx had all been cut. Franklin Raper suffered very severe head injuries by either a bat or a baton, and he had been beaten so badly that his head and face were completely distorted, and he had fragments of bone in his brain. His right arm was broken, and he had also been stabbed in the neck, and his right carotid artery and larynx had been cut. Richard Ritchie suffered multiple stab wounds to his neck, back, abdomen, liver, and hands. His pulmonary artery and his heart had been sliced, and there was severe internal hemorrhaging in his chest cavity. His jugular vein, windpipe, and carotid artery were also cut. Darlene Paris suffered multiple contusions and lacerations of her scalp from either a bat or a baton. She also had stab wounds to her chest, neck, and defensive wounds on her hands. Darlene's ultimate cause of death was a severed throat, which was a wound that cut through her carotid vessels, her jugular vein, and her larynx, and extended all the way down to her spine. Darlene Paris's throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. There is one short documentary about this case, and Darlene's mother and stepfather are actually in it. And you can just tell that Darlene's death just completely shattered them. They're still suffering with it to this day. It just completely devastated their family. Darlene's mother said that she was forced to bury Darlene in a turtleneck because her wounds were just so awful. So now we're kind of back at the police investigation, and they have conducted the search warrant. They found all kind of weird stuff, all the incriminating evidence, the will of punishment, the military stuff, the satanic Bible, the journals, all that stuff has been found. But most importantly, they found bomb-making materials, which meant that they had grounds to arrest Gerald and his wife, Jennifer, because it was found in their home. So Gerald and Jennifer are both taken into custody, and Gerald's immediately questioned about the murders, but he's still denying that he had any part in it. And this time, he even has an alibi. He says that on the night of the murders, he was actually in a motel room with Ricky Vieira and David Beck in Oakdale. A Be on the Lookout was put out for David Beck, Ricky Vieira, and Jason LaMarche. At this point, the police are convinced they're all involved. David Beck and Ricky Vieira are very quickly found and taken into the station, but Jason LaMarche is still missing. Once police had Ricky and David into custody, they kind of pegged Ricky as like the most vulnerable, kind of the weakest link out of the bunch. And they just felt like they could get him talking. He seemed just more timid, and they got the idea that he might be willing to let some things slip. And police were right, because when they questioned Ricky, he started telling them all about the abuse, and he told them a lot about the cult as well. Ricky told them all about all the beatings, the forced sodomy, the will of punishment. He explained what that was. He told them all about the journals, but he's still not admitting to murder at this point. But that all changed when police convinced Ricky to take a polygraph test. And literally, as the technician is hooking him up to this machine and getting him all strapped in and everything, he looks at her and says, "Okay, I guess I should probably tell you that I killed Darlene Paris." And this is when some of the details about the murder really started to come out. Now, while all of this is going on, Jason LaMarche is still on the loose. At this point, I believe Ron Willie has already been found and taken into custody as well, so Jason LaMarche is the last person that they're looking for. And they just can't seem to find him. So they decide to pay his mother a visit, and she reveals to them that Jason is driving a white Hyundai. So now police are on the lookout for this white Hyundai, and they actually end up finding it pretty quickly at a gas station. But it's not Jason driving the car, it's actually a friend of his. And this friend said that a few days before the murders, Jason asked if they could switch cars for a little bit, and this person agreed. So now they are on the lookout for this person's car, which was a blue Nissan pickup truck. And they end up finding this truck as well, but by the time they get to it, it's abandoned. Jason LaMarche is long gone. So police are starting to get a little worried because they have this very dangerous multiple murderer cult member on the loose right now, and they're no closer to catching him. But then on May 27th, 1990, about a week after the murders, police get a break in the case. A woman called up and said that she is a friend of Jason LaMarche's, and he had called her and asked her if he could get a ride to Oregon. He had heard that she was going there, so he asked if he could catch a ride with her, and she agreed because she had no idea about the murders at this point. And she said on the way to Oregon, Jason just started confessing to the murders. And I'm not really sure why he did this. I don't really know what his end game was. Maybe he just needed to get it off his chest. I don't really know. But this friend managed to stay calm and basically act like it was no big deal until they stopped for the night at a motel in Oregon. Once Jason was in his room, she managed to kind of slip off and go to a phone, and she called for help. And very soon after this, the motel was completely surrounded by officers. And Jason LaMarche is finally arrested, and he is sent back to California. All of the men are eventually questioned and charged with murder, and all of them took their chances in court. Cruz, Beck, and Vieira were all convicted of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to death, and they're all still on death row to this day. Jason LaMarche was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 64 years to life. And Michelle Evans entered a plea agreement where she agreed that she would give over all of her testimony for a lesser sentence, and in the end she was only found guilty of being an accessory. She only had to spend 6 months in prison after she was sentenced. Ricky Vieira continues to appeal his conviction. He says that Gerald Cruz brainwashed him and he was completely under his control. He was afraid for his life, and that's the only reason why he committed the murders. And I do believe that Ricky Vieira was totally brainwashed and he was pushed into participating. I mean, he definitely has to spend life in prison for what he did. I don't think any of this would have happened if Gerald Cruz wouldn't have been involved. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that the cult members should have been sentenced to death? And what about Michelle Evans? Do you think 6 months was a long enough sentence for her? I mean, I do understand that a lot of times in these cases, these types of agreements are necessary because the family wants answers. And a lot of times a plea agreement is the way to get that information. But 6 months just seems just way too light for what she did. She played a pretty big role in this. She didn't kill anyone herself, but she definitely helped out. Franklin Raper was a grandfather when he was killed. Despite his feud with Gerald and his group, he still did not deserve to die, especially in the extremely brutal way that he did. Darlene Paris, Richard Ritchie, and Dennis Colwell were all completely innocent in all of this. They were just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's so tragic that all of this happened. And that was the case of the camp cult, or the cause, or the Order of the Lion, whatever you want to call them. Before I go, a couple of things. First, please go follow me on Instagram. I'm really trying to build my community over there, and I currently have like no followers. So it would really help me out if you guys took the time to go over there and follow me. I'm really trying to get better about posting over there, and it'll be a way for you guys to get a little glimpse into my personal life, get to know me a little better if you even care about that kind of thing. But I will also be posting like updates on videos and updates on cases, and always post over there whenever I upload a new video. So, there'll be information like that as well. So yeah, go follow me if you want. I will link my Instagram in the description box, and you can also find it on my homepage in the banner. And second, I know you guys like the cult cases, and I do too. I promise I have a very long list of cults that I'm going to be covering on this channel. I do want to mix in other types of cases as well. My channel is still so new. I just started in July of this year, and I don't want to like back myself into a corner where I feel like I can only talk about cult cases, because there are so many other really interesting topics that I want to talk about. So my next case will not be a cult related case. As always, I am committed to getting better and better and bringing you all the best content that I possibly can. So yeah, hopefully you'll still enjoy the non-cult cases and you'll find them just as interesting. And that's all from me today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and for watching this video. If this content is your thing, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload content just like this every other Sunday. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.